Most people go through life believing they're good, simply because they've never really caused any damage. They look at the lack of conflict around them, the lack of aggression, the lack of disruption, and they assume that must mean they're virtuous. In their mind, if their presence hasn't created problems or destruction, then their character must be solid and their intentions must be good. But that assumption deserves a closer look, because sometimes the absence of harm has very little to do with moral choice. In many cases, the explanation is much simpler. In many situations, the reason harm never occurs is simply because the person never had the ability to cause it. Someone who lacks physical strength isn't likely to start a fight, but that doesn't automatically mean they possess the wisdom to avoid one. Someone who lacks influence can't easily manipulate others, but that doesn't necessarily mean they chose honesty. When the ability isn't there in the first place, restraint isn't really a decision. It's just the reality of the situation. And when people confuse limitation with virtue, they start misunderstanding what character actually is. Over time, that confusion begins shaping how they see themselves. This misunderstanding creates a quiet illusion that many people carry with them for years. They see themselves as peaceful people, when in truth they may have simply never developed the ability to be anything else. Their lives never demanded real restraint because they never possessed meaningful power, leverage, or capability. Without realizing it, they end up interpreting weakness as proof of moral success. It's very easy to feel comfortable living inside that illusion. A person can look at their calm, uneventful life and conclude they must be a good person because nothing dramatic has ever happened. They haven't caused conflict, they haven't shaken systems, and they haven't intimidated anyone with their presence. But the real question isn't just whether harm has happened. The deeper question is whether the person ever had the ability to cause it in the first place. If someone doesn't have the strength to break something, the fact that nothing is broken doesn't automatically prove wisdom. If someone doesn't have the voice or influence to sway others, their silence might not be restraint at all. Many people mistake their small reach for moral discipline, when in reality it's simply a reflection of undeveloped ability. The difference between those two things is significant, yet most people never stop long enough to notice it. That distinction becomes clearer once ability enters the picture. Real virtue only starts to show itself once ability enters the picture. The moment someone becomes capable of causing harm, their choices begin to carry real meaning. Before that point, much of their behavior is shaped by circumstance rather than character. They don't avoid wrongdoing because they've mastered themselves. They avoid it because they lack the tools to act differently. That realization can be uncomfortable. It asks people to rethink the story they've been telling themselves about who they are. For years, they may have believed they were calm, patient, and restrained. But when they take an honest look at their lives, they might realize those qualities were never truly tested. Without temptation, influence, or strength, restraint was never required. Think about the difference between someone who can't raise their voice and someone who chooses not to. One person is limited by weakness, while the other is guided by control. On the surface, the behavior might look exactly the same, but internally, the reality is completely different. One situation represents helplessness, while the other represents mastery. Most people never explore that difference because it forces them to face an uncomfortable truth. They start to see that their harmlessness may not come from noble character at all. Instead, it might simply be the result of limited ability, undeveloped discipline, and potential that was never built. Few people enjoy confronting that realization, but it's one of the most important insights a person can have. Once it becomes visible, the direction of improvement begins to change. Once that truth becomes visible, the focus begins to change. Instead of asking how to remain harmless, the question becomes how to become capable. Attention shifts towards strengthening the mind, improving communication, sharpening skills, and building discipline. Each of these things increases a person's ability to influence the world around them. At first, that idea can feel unsettling because greater capability also means greater potential for harm. The stronger someone becomes, the more damage they could theoretically cause if they lost control. That's exactly why many people quietly avoid developing their abilities. Remaining harmless feels safer because it avoids the responsibility that strength eventually brings. But a life built around harmlessness is also a life built around limitation. It means a person never develops the strength to defend what matters to them. They never gain the influence to improve their surroundings. They never acquire the ability to shape outcomes in meaningful ways. Their life stays quiet, not because they deliberately chose peace, but because they never developed the power to create change. The reality is that genuine goodness requires the presence of strength. Kindness means far more when the person has the ability to act differently. Patience carries more weight when it belongs to someone capable of decisive action. Restraint only becomes meaningful when it limits a real capacity for harm. Without strength, what looks like virtue can sometimes just be powerlessness. Without capability, true moral choices rarely appear. A person who cannot create disruption might appear peaceful, but that peace has never actually been tested by real influence or authority. This is where the first stage of the journey begins. The gap between you and being dangerous doesn't start with aggression or hostility. It begins with the slow and deliberate development of capability. The stronger your abilities become, the more meaningful your choices eventually become as well. Capability turns harmlessness into potential. Once someone gains strength, discipline, and competence, their actions start to carry weight. Their words begin influencing people. Their decisions begin shaping outcomes. Their presence starts affecting environments in ways that were never possible before. That shift introduces a new level of responsibility, but it also introduces a deeper level of character. A capable person who chooses restraint demonstrates something far more powerful than simple harmlessness. They show self-control, judgment, and awareness. But none of that can exist until ability appears in the first place. Until someone builds strength of mind, clarity of thought, and disciplined habits, their harmlessness is mostly accidental. It's the result of limited capability rather than a conscious moral choice. That's why developing ability marks the beginning of the journey. The moment someone begins building competence, the distance between weakness and strength starts to shrink. As that gap closes, their decisions begin to carry real meaning. And that is the point where character truly begins to reveal itself. When people hear the word dangerous, they usually picture anger, hostility, or reckless aggression. They imagine someone driven by emotion, someone who loses control and causes destruction without thinking about consequence. But that picture is incomplete, and in many cases, it's simply wrong. The most dangerous people in any environment are rarely the loudest, the most emotional, or the most openly aggressive. Real danger usually begins with competence. It develops quietly through ability, discipline, and understanding. Someone who can think clearly, communicate effectively, and act with precision holds far more influence than someone who only reacts with force. Competence gives a person reach, and reach gives their actions real weight. Think about the difference between someone who talks all the time and someone who speaks carefully with purpose. The first person might create a lot of noise, but the second person can actually move people. Their words carry influence because they're backed by thought, preparation, and confidence. Over time, that influence turns into leverage, and leverage is a form of power many people underestimate. Competence can show up in many different ways. It appears in the disciplined mind that can organize complicated ideas clearly. It appears in the trained body that can endure difficulty and pressure. It appears in the person who communicates well enough to guide others toward action. Each of these abilities might seem ordinary by itself, but when they combine in one person, they begin creating something far more powerful. Influence almost never comes from just one talent. It grows from consistent capability across multiple areas of life. Someone who thinks clearly, but struggles to communicate, won't move people very far. Someone who speaks confidently, but lacks discipline, will eventually lose credibility. Real competence emerges when thinking, speaking, and acting begin to work together. As that alignment develops, the person becomes more effective in the environments around them. Their ideas gain attention because they are explained clearly. Their actions produce results because they're guided by preparation. People start noticing that when this person speaks or acts, things actually happen. That's the moment when competence begins turning into power. Power doesn't always look dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it's simply the ability to shift the direction of a conversation. Sometimes it's the ability to organize people around a shared goal. Sometimes it's the quiet authority that comes from producing consistent results over long periods of time. Many people feel uneasy when they encounter this kind of power. They can sense that it carries the potential to influence outcomes beyond ordinary effort. A competent person can shape decisions, redirect effort, and alter the course of events. When that kind of influence appears, people start realizing that ability always carries consequences. Power always includes the possibility of harm. The same competence that allows someone to build something valuable also gives them the capacity to damage what already exists. The disciplined mind that organizes productive work could also organize destructive efforts. The persuasive voice that inspires cooperation could just as easily manipulate confusion if guided by poor character. For that reason, competence itself can make people uncomfortable. Some people prefer environments where no one has much ability because everything feels safer when influence is evenly limited. When someone begins demonstrating clear competence, that balance shifts. Suddenly, one person has the ability to move things forward while others remain where they are. The discomfort that follows isn't always fear. Sometimes it's simply the recognition that responsibility now exists. Once someone becomes capable, they can no longer claim helplessness when outcomes occur. Their ability puts them in a position where their decisions carry visible consequences. That realization forces a higher level of awareness. When a person understands that their words influence people and their actions shape environments, they must start paying closer attention to how they behave. Carelessness becomes more expensive because competence magnifies its effects. This magnification is exactly what makes competence the beginning of danger. Someone with little ability can make mistakes without causing much damage because their reach is small. But a competent person operates with greater influence, meaning their decisions travel further and affect more people. The same pattern appears everywhere. A skilled builder can create structures that last for decades, but those same skills could weaken foundations if used irresponsibly. A disciplined thinker can organize powerful ideas, but that same discipline could also justify harmful decisions if guided by poor judgment. Capability amplifies outcomes. It makes success stronger and failure more destructive. That's why competence eventually has to be paired with wisdom and control. Without those qualities, ability alone becomes unpredictable. Even with those risks, competence is still essential. Without it, people remain stuck in harmless limitation. They can't shape their circumstances. They can't defend what matters to them, and they can't influence the direction of their environment. Their intentions might be positive, but their impact stays small. When competence begins to develop, life starts to shift. Opportunities appear that weren't available before. Responsibility increases because others start recognizing the person's ability. Decisions that once seemed minor suddenly carry greater consequences because more people are affected by them. At that point, the person moves closer to the line that separates harmlessness from danger. Their ability has created leverage, and that leverage means their actions now carry real weight. The distance between weakness and influence begins to close. But competence alone doesn't determine whether that influence becomes constructive or destructive. Ability only creates potential. It opens the door to greater impact, but it doesn't guarantee wise decisions. The next step depends on something far more demanding than skill. The person has to learn how to control the power they've built. Once someone develops competence, a new challenge quietly appears in their life. The challenge isn't about learning more skills or gaining even more influence. Those things may continue naturally with time and effort. The real challenge becomes learning how to control the power that competence has created. Capability by itself isn't automatically good or bad. It's simply potential. A sharp mind, a confident voice, a disciplined body, or an organized approach to solving problems can all be used to build something valuable. But those same abilities can also cause damage if they're driven by impulse instead of judgment. That's why skill is only the beginning of development, not the end of it. History is full of examples of people who had tremendous ability, but lacked the discipline to guide it properly. Their intelligence, strength, or influence placed them in powerful positions, but without restraint, those qualities created chaos. Relationships fell apart, organizations collapsed, and trust disappeared because capability was allowed to operate without control. Strength without discipline is like a powerful engine without steering. The power exists and the movement exists, but the direction becomes unpredictable. A person might move quickly and impressively for a while, but eventually, the lack of control leads to damage. The same abilities that once looked impressive begin causing problems for everyone involved. Discipline is what transforms raw capability into reliable power. It provides the internal structure that allows someone to decide when to act, when to pause, and when to stay silent. Without that structure, ability becomes reactive. With discipline, ability becomes intentional. One of the most important forms of discipline is emotional control. People naturally experience anger, frustration, excitement, and pride. And those emotions can easily influence behavior if they're not managed carefully. When someone possesses real capability, emotional reactions can create consequences that extend far beyond a single moment. Imagine someone with strong communication skills losing their temper during a disagreement. Their words can cut far deeper than those of someone who lacks influence. A careless statement from an articulate person can damage trust that took years to build. Their ability amplifies the emotional reaction, turning a brief moment into a lasting consequence. The same principle applies to action. Someone with physical confidence or organizational authority must learn when not to use it. The urge to prove ability can be strong, especially when others challenge or provoke them. But the strongest demonstration of discipline isn't showing strength. It's knowing when to hold it back. This restraint often confuses people who misunderstand controlled power. They might assume calm behavior means weakness, because they don't see the strength behind it. But those who understand discipline see something entirely different. They recognize a person who has the ability to act forcefully, yet chooses not to unless it becomes necessary. That choice requires ongoing awareness. Discipline isn't a single decision someone makes once and then forgets about. It's a daily process of managing thoughts, reactions, and impulses. Every environment presents new situations that test a person's ability to remain calm and deliberate. As capability grows, those tests become more frequent. A person with influence will face disagreements, opportunities for advantage, and moments where they could easily overpower others if they chose to. Each moment becomes a test of discipline. The person must decide whether their actions will be driven by impulse or by principle. Without discipline, power becomes unpredictable. Sometimes it produces impressive results, and other times it creates damage that takes years to repair. People quickly learn to distrust people whose abilities operate without control. No one feels comfortable around someone who possesses strength but lacks restraint. The people who earn the greatest respect are those who demonstrate both ability and control. Others can sense that this person could act decisively if necessary, but they also know that they are guided by careful judgment. Their strength becomes reassuring instead of threatening because it's balanced by discipline. This balance changes how people respond to them. Instead of fearing their capability, others begin trusting it. They know decisions won't be reckless. They understand influence won't be used carelessly. Over time, that trust becomes one of the most powerful forms of authority someone can develop. Discipline also strengthens the person internally. When someone learns to manage their impulses, they gain clarity about their intentions. Their actions become deliberate rather than reactive. They begin understanding that true strength isn't measured by how quickly they can assert power, but by how wisely they choose to use it. That realization marks an important step in closing the gap between weakness and dangerous capability. At first, the journey focuses on building competence and skill. Then it shifts towards something more demanding, mastering the person who now holds that power. A disciplined person understands that every ability carries responsibility. The stronger their influence becomes, the more carefully they must guide it. They can't allow frustration, pride, or impatience to control their behavior. Their discipline becomes the safeguard that protects others from the potential harm their power could create. In that way, discipline becomes the real measure of strength. Many people can develop certain abilities with effort, but far fewer learn to control those abilities with consistent judgment. The difference between the two determines whether capability becomes constructive leadership or uncontrolled disruption. The gap between you and dangerous doesn't close through skill alone. It closes when skill becomes governed by discipline, when strength learns restraint, when influence learns responsibility, and when ability learns patience. A different kind of power begins to appear. It's the kind of power that acts when necessary and remains calm when it isn't. That's the type of strength people respect, trust, and ultimately choose to follow. The moment a person becomes capable, life begins to change around them in quiet ways. Actions that once felt small or unnoticed start carrying greater consequences. Words that once passed by without much attention begin shaping how others think, respond, and behave. Capability increases the reach of a person's presence. And with that larger reach comes a level of responsibility that many people don't recognize right away. Before someone develops real competence, it's easy to believe their choices don't matter very much. Their influence is limited, their voice doesn't carry much weight, and their decisions rarely affect anything beyond their immediate circumstances. During that stage of life, many people feel comfortable assuming their actions mostly affect themselves. They believe their mistakes will stay contained within their own experience. But as ability grows, that belief gradually fades. A capable person begins to notice that their behavior influences far more than just their own results. Their attitude affects the people working beside them. Their decisions start changing the direction of projects, discussions, and plans. Even their example begins to set a tone that others quietly observe and sometimes follow. Responsibility rarely shows up all at once with some obvious announcement. Instead, it appears slowly through the expanding impact of a person's influence. A disciplined worker begins setting a standard that others notice. A thoughtful speaker can redirect the course of a conversation. Someone who consistently keeps their commitments gradually changes what the people around them expect. At first, these changes may seem small, but over time they add up. The more capable someone becomes, the more their behavior shapes the environment they operate in. People begin looking toward them when decisions need to be made. Their opinion begins to matter because their past actions have proven their competence. This shift often surprises people who never expected to carry that kind of influence. They may have developed skills simply to improve their own life, only to realize that others now respond differently to them. Their actions are watched more closely, their words stick with people longer, and their choices start affecting outcomes beyond their own immediate concerns. As that influence grows, responsibility becomes harder to ignore. At that point, responsibility can't really be ignored anymore. A capable person can no longer pretend that what they do doesn't matter. Once someone has influence, even small decisions create ripple effects. A careless comment can discourage someone who is trying to improve. A thoughtful remark can motivate someone who had nearly given up. The same pattern appears in leadership, whether the role is formal or informal. Some people are placed in official positions of authority, but many others gain influence simply by demonstrating consistent competence. People naturally begin to follow those who show clarity, reliability, and discipline. When that happens, the capable person may find themselves guiding others without ever asking for that role. That influence introduces a new level of accountability. The person now has to think not only about what they can do, but also about what they should do. Capability expands the number of choices available, but it also requires greater awareness of the consequences behind those choices. Every action becomes a signal that others may interpret as direction. If a capable person ignores that responsibility, confusion can spread through their environment. When people with influence behave carelessly, they send mixed signals to those who are paying attention. Others may start copying their behavior, assuming that competence somehow justifies impulsive decisions. Over time, that confusion weakens trust and stability within the group. On the other hand, when capable people act with thoughtful responsibility, their influence becomes constructive. Their behavior provides a quiet example of discipline and reliability. People begin to see that strength and responsibility belong together, and they adjust their own behavior accordingly. This relationship between capability and responsibility becomes one of the most important lessons in personal development. Many people pursue ability because they want more control over their own lives. They want the freedom to make choices, the confidence to chase opportunities, and the influence to shape their circumstances. But the moment those abilities appear, responsibility arrives alongside them. Responsibility isn't something others impose on capable people. It's simply the natural result of influence. The more power someone has, the more their actions affect the people around them. That reality exists whether a person wants it or not. Because of that reality, some people react by shrinking away from their potential. They sense the weight of responsibility and decide it might be easier to remain harmless. By keeping their abilities limited, they believe they can avoid the pressure that comes with influence. But avoiding ability rarely leads to a satisfying life. When someone intentionally limits themselves, they may escape responsibility, but they also avoid growth. Their influence stays small, their opportunities stay narrow, and most of their potential remains unused. The comfort they gain comes at the cost of meaningful contribution. Others take a different path. They accept that capability will inevitably bring responsibility, and they choose to grow into that reality. Instead of avoiding influence, they learn how to guide it wisely. They begin to recognize that their decisions help shape the culture of their workplace, their community, and their relationships. When that awareness develops, a person starts behaving more deliberately. They pay closer attention to the tone of their words. They consider the example their actions set. They begin to understand that leadership isn't defined by titles, but by influence. And influence grows stronger when it's guided by responsibility. A responsible person understands that their decisions help shape the structure of the environments around them. Their presence can stabilize a situation or create unnecessary tension. Their discipline can encourage others to raise their standards. Their consistency can bring order to environments that might otherwise drift into confusion. In this way, capability shifts from being a personal advantage to becoming a shared impact. Someone who once focused only on improving themselves begins to realize that their growth affects other people. Their competence becomes something that influences outcomes beyond their own experience. That realization marks another step in closing the gap between weakness and dangerous capability. Strength by itself is not enough. Discipline alone is not enough. A person must also accept the responsibility that naturally comes with influence. When ability, discipline, and responsibility begin working together, a person becomes someone whose presence truly matters. Their decisions carry weight because they understand their consequences. Their actions create stability because they recognize their role in shaping the environment around them. At that point, they stand much closer to the line that separates harmlessness from meaningful power. Their capability has matured into influence, and that influence now carries responsibility that cannot be ignored. Yet even at this stage, the idea of becoming dangerous is often misunderstood. When people first hear the idea of becoming dangerous, they often misunderstand what it actually means. They imagine intimidation, domination, or someone trying to control others through fear. But that isn't the real goal. The point is not to become threatening to the world around you. The real goal is to close the gap between weakness and strength so that your character actually matters. Weakness often disguises itself as kindness. Someone who lacks strength might believe they are generous simply because they never confront anyone. They might believe they are patient because they rarely take decisive action. But when you examine the situation more closely, it often becomes clear that their restraint comes from uncertainty rather than principle. A harmless person can appear agreeable in almost every situation because they lack the ability to change the outcome anyway. Their cooperation costs them very little. Their kindness requires minimal sacrifice because they don't have much influence over the situation in the first place. Without the power to disrupt anything, their goodness has never really been tested. Real character begins to show itself only when someone has the strength to act differently. When a person has the ability to cause harm, their decision to show restraint becomes a real moral choice. Their kindness carries weight because it comes from judgment instead of limitation. Think about two people behaving politely in a difficult situation. One stays calm because they feel incapable of standing up for themselves. The other stays calm even though they have the strength to dominate the moment if they wanted to. From the outside, their behavior might look exactly the same, but internally, the difference is enormous. The first person is acting from weakness. Their politeness is simply the safest option available. The second person is acting from control. Their calmness is a deliberate choice made, despite having the ability to do something else. This difference completely changes the meaning of goodness. When strength and discipline exist alongside restraint, a person becomes someone others can truly trust. Their behavior isn't guided by fear or hesitation. It's guided by values that remain steady, even when they have the power to impose their will. A person like that becomes a stabilizing presence in any environment. Others can sense that they are capable, yet they also recognize that their capability is guided by integrity. Their strength doesn't create tension because it's balanced by responsibility and restraint. When someone capable chooses integrity, people naturally begin relying on them. In uncertain situations, others look toward people who demonstrate both competence and character. They understand that strength guided by principle creates safety rather than danger. This is where the idea of being dangerous takes on its real meaning. A dangerous person isn't someone who seeks conflict. It's someone whose abilities are strong enough that their actions could create serious consequences if misused. Because that ability exists, their character must be strong enough to guide it wisely. When someone like that chooses patience instead of aggression, their restraint becomes meaningful. When they choose honesty, even though manipulation might benefit them, their integrity becomes visible. Their decisions carry weight because they have the power to act differently. People tend to trust people who possess controlled strength. Someone who lacks ability may have good intentions, but they might not be able to protect what matters when challenges appear. A capable person, however, can defend principles, support others, and stabilize situations that might otherwise fall apart. Strength used for protection becomes one of the most valuable qualities a person can develop. The same power that could cause harm becomes a shield that protects people, ideas, and institutions worth preserving. When guided by character, power becomes constructive rather than destructive. Maintaining that balance requires constant awareness. A capable person must remember that their abilities always carry consequences. Their influence can shape the mood of a room, shift the direction of a discussion, or determine the outcome of an important decision. That awareness naturally encourages humility because the person understands the weight of their actions. Humility doesn't mean denying strength. It simply means recognizing that strength exists for a purpose beyond personal pride. They understand that their ability allows them to contribute to stability and progress in the environments they are part of. When strength, discipline, responsibility, and integrity come together, the gap between weakness and dangerous capability finally closes. The person is no longer harmless simply because they lack ability. They're capable of significant influence, yet they deliberately guide that influence with care. At that point, goodness becomes meaningful because it's supported by strength. Kindness becomes powerful because it's reinforced by discipline. Leadership becomes trustworthy because it grows from responsibility rather than ambition. Someone who reaches this stage no longer needs to constantly prove their ability. Their presence already demonstrates it. Others can sense that the person has both the ability to act decisively and the judgment to know when restraint is the better choice. That is the final step in closing the gap between you and dangerous. It isn't about intimidation or aggression. It's about developing strength that is guided by character. When capability and integrity operate together, a person becomes someone whose power is used for protection, creation, and leadership rather than harm.